Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Wednesday, October 6th, 2021. I don't know. Everything sounds a little weird today. But, all right. It looks like it's all working just fine. I don't know. You tell me. I guess you can't if it's not. But it looks like it's okay. Just checking all the levels every place and making sure it's all good. I'm sure I'll get the thumbs up from Justice any second now, as he usually does. Even unprompted. Every day I get that signal. So, okay, everything appears to be okay. I think I'm just positioned differently and hearing things differently in my headphones. The Kagro in the Morning radio show is live now. We'll just go with it. Bill says it's true. Justice says everything's cool and fine, too. Kagro X, according to Bill, reminds you that if you don't hang your socks on the clothesline together, oh, that's a good idea. Please do that. They will most assuredly hang separately. Well, okay, I think Benjamin Franklin did say that. PolitiFact rates this claim true. I do too. Please make sure your stocks stay together. I once bought a product, by the way. I actually went out and bought a product. It wasn't much. That was designed to keep your socks together in the dryer. And I used them for a while until I realized, God, this is stupid. I can't take it anymore. But there were these little plastic cuffs, essentially, and you would stick your socks in them in order to, the tops of the socks, and then you wouldn't have to match them back together, except then I think I just realized, well, I really don't need to match them back together anyway, but that's one of those OCD sorts of things that I tend to do anyway, and I guess I thought I would relieve myself of the pressure of trying to match them and failing and wondering had I mismatched some socks, and the same socks too. It's just, I want these two worn together at all times, and I realized that was probably not necessary, and maybe sign of illness, and the products are still there, though. Of course, I held on to them. I think I put them away somewhere. Well, what if I change my mind later, and I have to pay another 50 cents for these things? That'll show me. Okay, well, that led nowhere, but it's better than talking about the total economic meltdown of the entire world. I think the entire world. Of course, we still face our debt limit crisis, I guess, here in this country. I mean, we've come close to the brink before and come back from it. And each time there's been some indication that, that the Republicans would be irresponsible and try to force a default. They've been flirting with this for a while. They've done it a couple of times, but each time we turn away at the last second. This time, I don't know. This time it's prompting a lot of talk, even from, reporters and people covering the White House, and the president is answering. Do you think you might have to possibly nuke the filibuster, or at least a limited nuclear strike on the filibuster to eliminate the possibility of a number of things, including the filibustering of a straight-up vote on a debt ceiling cure of one kind or another? And, of course, they've been discussing this for a long time in the context of the voting rights legislation, that if you're dealing with a top-level constitutional issue like voting rights, that maybe you ought to nuke the filibuster for that, too. I don't know how they would define that. And that would be a wide-open door, and you could probably force just about anything through it. But that's okay. For those of us who think the filibuster is a ridiculous holdover, nuking it in part, and when you tell us, well, then there's nothing theoretically separating this maneuver from Republicans doing it for anything else in the future. And we say, we know that's true. And I think apparently the Republicans are begging for us to do that so that they can use it to get rid of something else in the future, although they don't actually need our permission to do it. All you need is a majority, and that was always the case. So, anyway, I thought that was kind of an interesting thought. Weirder still is that they are circulating the idea of nuking the filibuster on a time-limited basis. I just saw Joan tweeting about this because it's kind of ridiculous. But I saw somebody talking about it yesterday, and she's got the same tweet in mind, the tweet of Lindsay Wise. Let's take a look at this one because I put it aside once I saw it yesterday. Lindsay Wise is who? She is a congressional correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, which means I won't be able to read what she writes because it'll be paywalled, but that's their model. It's a lengthy, not that lengthy, tweet thread about the issue, but what she gets around to is in the third tweet or so here. She just begins, she's got this from Senator Angus King. She starts on changing filibuster rules to raise the debt ceiling. Angus King saying, I've been consistently very skeptical of the idea of changing the filibuster rules, that is. But this is so beyond the pale, the debt ceiling gamesmanship, so beyond the pale in terms of responsibility. We have a responsibility to the people of this country that transcends the Senate rule. Certainly, we've talked about it both in, this is a new senator, Chris Murphy now commenting. We've certainly talked about it both in caucus and privately. And Murphy says Dems are considering filibuster rule changes to raise the debt ceiling. And then says, because if you're ever going to change the filibuster, doing it to stop the meltdown of the economy is a pretty good reason. True, good reason. Odd statement because, we have changed the filibuster. If you're ever going to change the filibuster, like we have a couple of times, this would be another good reason is what he really means. But this is the one that caught everyone else's eye here. Lindsay saying, let me let Greg in the door. Murphy and other Democrats said they are discussing a possible, this is the weird one, a possible one-day elimination of the filibuster. Like that, wasn't there a movie or a TV show where, one day a year, all bets are off with the law, you can do anything you want. One-day elimination of the filibuster. It's not necessarily annual, but a one-day elimination in order to raise the debt ceiling, or potentially a permanent carve-out that would make it against the Senate rules to filibuster debt ceiling increases. She wraps up the thread here with, I've heard some people talk about it literally. We change the rules for a day, and the rules return for everything the next day, versus changing it permanently for the filibuster, Chris Murphy said. But everything rides on Manchin and Sinema. Of course, that's true, too. Good reminder from Lindsay. They would have to agree to something like that. And that's an unusual, an unusual idea. You can do it. You can do anything you want. And I saw some people struggling, some of the Senate procedure nerds out there yesterday trying to come up with a name for it. If getting rid of the filibuster entirely is the nuclear option, and getting rid of the filibuster just for the debt ceiling people are saying, well, is it a tactical nuclear option? They were arguing. Is it tactical nuclears? Or is it a neutron bomb? Or what is it? And then they were trying to come up with a name for this time-limited thing, which appears, I think it's fairly obvious that I would call it a time bomb, I guess. But if you wanted to keep the nuclear theme going, the atomic clock is another interesting thing you could call it. And it counts down for a day and then returns us to pre-nuclear times. It's a little weird as a suggestion. Joan is a little, perturbed by it, saying, look, if you're going to do it, just do something real and get rid of the thing and at least end it for, get rid of the debt limit forever if you're going to do that. And then, hey, why not pass voting rights and some abortion rights and expand the Supreme Court while you're at it if you're going to do it for just a day. Weird idea. Don't know if that one will fly. Greg Dworkin is here. He's only here for the day, but then he'll come back tomorrow. And then, so we might as well get to this stuff here. Can't wait that much longer, right, Greg? Let's go. How you doing today?
Well, you only have a certain limited amount of time on this earth. I think they should just call it the BFD Junior.
Why not? Yes,
it's only for a day, and during that day you can pass voting rights and expand the Supreme Court, and then get back to it's like sales tax free Monday.
Sure.
Do it all the time.
The nuclear weapons, the atomic bombs we have used also had dumb nicknames, so you can name it whatever you want, right? There were Fat Man and Little Boy, right? Something like that. So it doesn't really matter. Although you might want to think, well, posterity will record this. I ought to come up with a better name. It's
best to do it with sidekicks. So you have to do Little Joe and BFD Junior, and come up with something for Little Joe. Well, it's Biden's agenda, so why not?
Yeah, right. Well, and I guess he was asked about it, and he's saying, they're considering. I'm not a senator anymore, but they're considering all sorts of things because getting the debt ceiling taken care of is kind of a must.
Right. So let's just put this in plain English because plain English is good. Okay. Here's a Quinnipiac poll from yesterday with some mixed news in it. Democratic spending bills retain majority support. Quinnipiac University national poll finds, but Democrats in Congress lose ground.
Hmm.
All right. And you can look at the numbers, but the concepts are what's important. Americans say 62-34. They support a $1 trillion spending bill to improve the nation's roads and bridges, and 57-40 that they support a $3.5 trillion, which is going to be $2 trillion. Everybody sort of agrees with now, on social programs such as child care, education, family tax breaks, and expanding Medicare for seniors, compared to 62-32 in August. So it's still pretty good. Democrats support the bill 92-5, independents split 50-48, Republicans oppose 68-28. But the other bottom line number is actually Republicans have taken a slight lead in who should you vote to control Congress. Now, this isn't a surprise. What's happening is that the media is painting the Dems in disarray picture every hour of every day for months on negotiating what's going on. So it all goes away if you pass something, and it all sticks in concrete if you don't pass something. So that's pretty clear. So the side of the Democrats and the thinking of the Democrats ought to be laser focused. McConnell doesn't really care about the country and never has, and neither does anybody else in Congress for that matter. They care about re-election. That's it, nothing else.
All right.
And then some of them care about, okay, who's going to pay for my retirement? So what kind of cushy lobbying job, boardroom thing can I get? In the meantime, if that's the way that you're thinking, and it is, then you're going to say, okay, chaos is good for Republicans because the Democrats are in power, and therefore people will blame the Democrats no matter what happens, even if we did it.
Probably
if we
true.
blow up Congress, since Democrats are in charge, it's obviously their fault because they didn't stop us. So that's what should focus Democrats' minds about this. And that's why you're thinking about Little Joe and BFD Junior and the atomic clock and all the other, things that you might be able to do. And, of course, worrying about what to call it rather than what the substance of it is exactly what reporters do when it comes to policy in Congress. So, it makes sense you'll spend a lot of time doing that and very little time about, what about getting it done? So my theme for the pundit roundup this morning actually was that the Democrats are negotiating, and the media is just incredibly impatient and wants it done yesterday and doesn't understand why it can't be done yesterday, and so therefore it's the Democrats' fault. So you can see it in the Quinnipiac poll. It's a popular program. That's not enough to get it passed. It might make the Democrats lose Congress if they don't get their act together. That should focus them.
You'd think. I mean,
and well, it certainly focused Republicans because that's exactly what they're doing.
Oh,
why is Mitch McConnell being so irresponsible? Because he wants to be the majority leader. And if you really want to get to the bottom of what's going on here and fix it, make sure he's not majority leader. How do you do that? Well, you actually pass this thing.
Okay.
That's the part about Sinema I don't get. I think Manchin gets it, and he's willing to negotiate, and he's got a number. And he's okay with 1.9 to 2.2, and he gets to say, I stopped the radical Democrats from doing too much, and I got what we needed for West Virginia, and he can walk away happy, and everybody will say, fine, Joe Manchin, you get what you want. Okay.
Yeah.
And the progressives in Congress, especially the House, are okay with that. They would much rather have more, but they're not going to get more. Bernie's going to be upset, but he's also very pragmatic, and he gets that you get what you can get. And a lot of the posturing now about we won't settle for a penny less is just trying to set the parameters for what you discuss. And that's how you bring Manchin from 1.5 to 2.2. And that's okay. I don't have a problem with that. And the press is not covering that as other than Dems are in disarray. But in fact, it's a standard negotiating thing. So that's fine. What's not fine is the fact that it's okay in the press's mind to ruin the country, throw us into recession in the middle of a pandemic because it's good for McConnell and therefore he's very savvy. I get that that's what they're doing. But that's like saying, look, I get that Capone murders a lot of people, but it's really good for business for him.
Yes, well, it was.
Well, it was, but that's kind of like not the point.
Oh, yes, right. Okay, now I get it. That's true. All right. I'm okay with that.
Well, okay. Well, that's the basic background.
Missing the point,
that is discussion.
Yes.
So we have a lot of different things going on here. Let's look at this one. I think is kind of interesting. This one is from David Rothkopf this morning in Daily Beast. The massive Biden reset you probably don't even know is happening. Part of the problem is an administration with too many press secretaries and not enough communication strategists. So the U.S. is in the midst of the most significant strategic shift in its foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. Why is it a secret? It marks a generational shift in how the U.S. views its national interests worldwide and its role in the world. The scope of the shift in how the U.S. approaches its national interests worldwide is so great that it touches on virtually every aspect of American policy abroad and at home. Unlike the shift that occurred after 9/11, it's not reactive, it's not narrowly driven by developments in a single region. It's truly strategic, based on recognition of sweeping global changes and anticipation of the consequences of the big trends reshaping the globe. Keep in mind Rothkopf's thing is foreign policy. Key elements of it have been in the making for years, but despite the great significance, many people don't even know it's happening. Well, that's why we bring this to your show, so people will know what's happening. The Biden administration has a compelling new vision about America's place in the world. Many of the elements of this policy transformation have received coverage, but it's tended to be driven by breaking news because that's the way news works.
Right. Submarines.
Right? The chapter of the history of U.S. international affairs that feature the global war on terror is closed. Years too late, good. But that's what happened in Afghanistan. Summarizing here. Also ended was a period of centrality of the Middle East. No longer dependent on foreign oil as we once were, no longer erroneously casting Islamist terror as the greatest threat facing the U.S., we could give our involvement in the region more appropriate weight. We could shift our focus to greater and more important challenges, from the rise of China to climate crisis, next generation security threats like cyber conflict, automated warfare. The headlines of the past 6 weeks have told the story of individual elements, but stories of our pull-off from Afghanistan focus more on the challenges confronted during the exit rather than placing it in historical context.
Yes.
For example. A parallel U.S. effort to shore up its Asia-Pacific capabilities with the U.S., UK, Australia nuclear-powered submarine story that we covered. Right. The fact that these events were timed in part to serve as a counterpoint to exiting Afghanistan was hardly mentioned anywhere. Similarly, the president's efforts to invest trillions in U.S. infrastructure and in engines of the U.S. economy were cast in domestic terms, but not contrasted as they should have been with the efforts to prioritize spending trillions during the past 2 decades on wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, or even creating greater wealth for America's wealthiest people. They were not seen as investments in American capabilities akin to Eisenhower's U.S. highway system. They've not been cast as vital steps to make sure the infrastructure is resilient against cyber attacks or the damaging effects of climate, which is what they should be. And they've seldom been seen as the steps to ensure we're more competitive with the rising powers of tomorrow like China. So the elements of Biden's Build Back Better plan, the BFD plan, the bilateral infrastructure framework plan, all of that stuff is popular with the public, as we just saw with Quinnipiac. But nobody's selling it as part of positioning the U.S. as a continuing major player around the world, preparing for the next decade's challenges, which they should. But then again, they didn't get the booster rollout correctly either. So they may be thinking correctly, arguably, because that's what you're supposed to argue about. But their messaging is awful.
Well, they're busy thinking.
Yeah, so they say. Now, in some cases, I get annoyed with people saying, well, the Democrats' messages are, well, in this case, the Democrats' messages really is awful because they're simply not spending time explaining stuff. And after the break, we'll deal with the coronavirus side of that. But this, in terms of domestic and foreign policy, is, as Joe Biden would say, a big effing deal. And so you really ought to, go, look, let me lay out for you what we're doing and why we're doing it, and let's make it clear. Rothkopf goes on to say, why is this message not getting through? Several reasons. One is that the media continues to prioritize conflict and catastrophe, making its money off of clicks and ratings. Just turn it on the nightly news. It's so different than when I used to watch Peter Jennings, let alone Walter Cronkite. Major disaster, then this, then feel-good story, then this, then that. And, each one of those stories is like a 45-second, I have a video to go with it. Doesn't really tell you what's going on underlying the story and and how we're going to fix it, And so, there's a new caravan forming down south. Well, there's a new storm. There's a new spill. What about the whole thing about how we got in the position where an anchor ripping up an oil pipeline off of pristine California puts us in the situation of being vulnerable to spills, et cetera, et cetera. No, they don't cover that.
Nor do they. Yeah, they could have
watching
covered it
watching NBC News, as I tend to do at night. one of the most annoying things is because NBC was broadcasting the game, they spent far more time talking about Tom Brady returning to New England to, play against the Patriots than they did about anything that was in any of Biden's economic proposals for a week.
Yeah, well,
and that just gives you an idea of what's going on. I'm not a Brady fan and I'm not a football fan, but for goodness sake, I don't care.
Right.
This is the nightly news, not the nightly, NBC commercial.
That's true. And maybe how about a story about how because we keep telling people that this is what they're interested in, they're eating horse paste instead of getting vaccines. Just
there is,
stop being dumb. Pay attention to something.
Yeah.
So
Rothkopf concludes with part of the responsibility lies with the administration. Some of this is for very good reasons of focusing on getting the work done, and they're busy, but that needs to be addressed. For now, the big story is largely being lost, and the American people in the world deserve to hear it. And really, he needs to come out with a primetime speech. This is our foreign policy, and let's just make it the Biden Doctrine.
Okay. It would be nice to have that explained to it. And it's a nice thing to remind everybody, there's large forces at work in the world here, and none of them are returning to New England for a single game. So,
but when you don't do
focus elsewhere. Yes.
Then you lose the perspective of what's going on here. Getting back to the debt ceiling crisis, and again, as we talked about on the show all last week, there's really no reason for a debt ceiling. We ought to get rid of it. Joan's right. But if you're not going to get rid of it, then fine. Do Little Joe and BFD Junior and just get it done. Steve Bannon writes for MSNBC, in debt ceiling crisis, Republican moderation is non-existent. The GOP's debt ceiling crisis offers a timely reminder those looking for actual Republican moderates on Capitol Hill will be looking for a long time. So again, what's driving them is McConnell convincing his caucus, as uncomfortable as the Romneys and the Murkowskis might be, McConnell has convinced his caucus, and not without reason, that if you let the U.S. blow up, that it's good for us politically.
Yeah. They've thought that for a long time. This is the fourth or fifth time that they've done something like this. It might be the most serious or the closest they ever come, or might
what frustrates me is Democrats are not running on good government. They ought to be running on good government. Good government is important, and Republicans clearly don't like big government. Not only would they let the economy go to hell if they possibly can, in fact, they're working to do that. They also don't believe in fair elections, and they're trying to get themselves elected or appointed to key positions in the states so that the next election is going to be legally overthrown. Why Democrats see 3 governors' races as a seawall for fair elections. This in the New York Times. Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania all have Democratic governors and GOP-led legislatures. And in all 3 battlegrounds, Republicans are pushing hard to rewrite election laws. Well, if you don't like that, elect Democratic governors. If you don't, because of the way the districts work, you don't have the power to elect Democratic legislatures like we finally did in Virginia. Thank you. Then at least make sure you have a Democratic governor.
Yes.
People like McAuliffe ought to be running on that. And those 3 other states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, ought to be running on that. And why is it so important? Because you have to set the predicate for why you're running and why it's important to come out and vote for you. Companion piece in the New York Times. Democrats lost the most in Midwestern factory towns, report says. The party struggles in communities that saw declines in manufacturing and union jobs and healthcare could more than offset its gains in metropolitan areas. So they're talking about places like Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, Bay City, Michigan, let alone crucial Waukesha County, poses a dire threat to Democrats, the report warns. Nationally and in the Midwest, Democrat gains in large metropolitan areas have offset their losses in rural areas, and while the party struggles in the industrial Midwest have been well chronicled, the 82-page report explicitly links Democratic decline in the region that elected Trump in 2016 to the sort of deindustrialization that has weakened liberal parties around the world. Now, go back to what I was talking about in terms of Rothkopf and why it's important that the Democrats and Biden have an overriding strategic vision for how they deal with the world. This is part of it. So if you're going to look toward the future, you have to say domestically And internationally, these things are linked. You have to have a clear plan going forward. We're not just bumbling our way through. There are strategic visions. We need to articulate them so you know what they are. And it's not just enough that we're putting the pieces in place together to do it. We now have to talk about how this all ties together. And so, there's perhaps it's not the job of Biden to do this by himself. Maybe Blinken and other people have to help him, but he can hire people.
He can't get them all confirmed necessarily. But,
but you can hire people to explain.
Yes.
You can hire communicators.
Well, sure. Yeah, right. It's a complicated task, and the importance of time. I love to emphasize the importance of tying things together on this show, and we do it whenever we can. Just sometimes getting the background context and things finally make sense. Even if
you can't do it in a day.
Bits.
Sometimes you have to spend a month explaining things, and then it all comes together. Just like when you explain congressional procedure, and then finally the vote comes up. And the first thing was that you made the rule, and then the next thing was cloture, and then the next thing was, okay, here's how it passed. And how it passed is the anticlimax, because all the other stuff had to get done first, and it was important.
Yeah.
And it told you where this was going. And so, we try to do that. Can't always, but we try to. And I think Biden should try to as well. And he can't always, but if you're not making any efforts, it's certainly not going to get done.
That's true. Of course, he has more than 2 hours a day to do it. But, it is important. And sometimes it takes us months to do it. He's
got more people than you do to help.
That's true, too. I have nobody here today in-house. So, anyway, we'll take our break, and a reminder also of how you brought that whole thing around to, by the way, filibuster, where did it come from? World War I. Just thought I would remind you of all of that. And, sometimes weaving these narratives together takes some time. But if you're the president, you can presumably do it a little quicker. We'll be right back. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, the same guy who was just talking to you a second ago. Our Patreon subscription drive is still going strong, with over 175 monthly donors who help keep us on the air. If we've helped keep you going during the pandemic, why not return the favor and help us keep going so we can all be together for the next disaster? Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it easy to make secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for keeping you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We literally could not do this without you. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We continue on with Greg Dworkin. Did you have something to add at the end there? It sounded like we ran out of time and you had something on your mind, and I thought maybe you made a note about it, but maybe not.
Nah.
Right. Oh, okay. Just another one of those things we throw in there. Tangents happen on the show.
Right.
All right.
I don't know if you've ever listened to the show on tape when you play it back.
This show?
But there are occasions, especially at the 10 o'clock hour, where a thought fades as the music comes on.
Ah, yes.
Well, it now happens at 9:32.
Okay. It's getting earlier and earlier.
Yeah.
Well, that does happen. It's jarring music, and it suddenly plays in your head, and it has the effect of knocking thoughts loose occasionally. That's true.
But at the same time, what happens is, technically, is that your voice starts to fade, and then the music gets louder, and so those very last couple of sentences get lost in the ether, and it's kind of fun. It's like a nice transition. And
people can tune in and try and figure out what were those things, and something very important.
Right. Well, it's a cooperational overlap, or shut the hell up, I'm talking, whatever you want to call it technically, the technical linguistic discussion about how David and I talk over each other is not always easy on the ears if you're not used to it, unless you're from New York, in which case it's like, well, everybody speaks that way.
True. Well, Zoom should have made you used to it.
You should come to Thanksgiving at my relatives. You think you're going to get a word in edgewise.
Yeah, right. And if you're the shy and retiring type, maybe that's good. You're not expected to talk. You don't have to. You can't work your way in anyway.
Yeah, anyway. So other big things, I'm not going to cover a whole lot, but the Facebook whistleblower had a moment talking about how Facebook basically is evil. And so what's going to come of that, I don't really know. But, it's just become clearer and clearer. I'm happier and happier I got off of Facebook 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, all right.
And never went back. I can live without it, and that's fine.
They're having a rough time, and they ought to. They're responsible for a lot of damage, but they've made a lot of money. That usually goes hand in hand, and they should take it and retire and get the hell out of here. But yeah.
Mr. Burns twiddling his fingers saying, excellent, because that's the deal there. So if you're going to negotiate with Mr. Burns, you're going to get what Mr. Burns has to sell you, which is probably toxic waste. Now, speaking of messaging, I found a fascinating article this morning in Politico, of all places, by Aaron Banco and Adam Cancron.
Okay. On what?
Top COVID experts privately urge Biden administration to scale back booster campaign. And you'll see why I found this so fascinating. Several of the outside experts objected to the administration's approach during a private off-the-record call with federal health officials. And so because it's off the record, naturally it's published in Politico.
Here you go. Right. Okay.
Right? A vocal contingent of prominent doctors and scientists is pressing the Biden administration to scrap its plans to provide booster shots to all previously vaccinated adults. That's not the plan. The plan is to do it for over 65, immunodeficient, and people who are in high-risk areas. They don't have a plan to do it for everyone.
So then
Fauci thinks eventually it might be needed for everyone, but that's not the current plan. So already they're distorting a little bit here.
Okay.
Several of the outside experts, including some who advised Joe Biden's transition team, objected to the administration's approach during a private off-the-record call. Current U.S. data on vaccine performance does not justify using boosters widely to reduce the risk of breakthrough infection and slow the virus's spread, the experts said. Why is that important? Because we've talked on the show about the fact that the public face of public health is to say, get these vaccines to keep yourself out of the hospital and don't die, which is important.
Oh, sure.
But the public doesn't want to get infected. And up until now, the public health people have dropped the ball on really explaining that part of it. Biden is pushing the boosters because Fauci, William Hazeltine, who's an ex-CDC guy, Mike Osterholm, who many people know as Dr. Doom, the person who's always talking about how bad the pandemic could get, are on the side of Biden saying, look, decreasing breakthrough infections is important to the public.
It is.
And the others are saying, that's not the issue. The issue is that we have to get shots to people who haven't gotten them yet, including the rest of the world, and making sure that our hospital system stays up, which is to say, get your shot so that you don't wind up in the hospital. Yes. The public, I would add, doesn't think that way. They don't think they're going to wind up in the hospital. Nobody thinks they're going to be the one to get in a car accident. The public thinks that hospitals and ICUs, based on news coverage, is for those guys who said, oh, I'm sorry, I changed my mind. I wish I had gotten the shot. That's what ICUs are for. Mm-hmm. For me, who got the shot, I'm worried about getting infected because I'm worried that the antibody stuff is going down, not up. And because of that, that's why I want to get the extra shot. And Biden says, yeah, that's why we're pushing it. I'm going to send you a little graph that you can include in the roundup that Scott Anderson does later that clearly illustrates this point. It's from Lancet, recent publication. And what it shows is that if you're looking at the efficacy of the vaccines, the straight line is about hospitalization. And so epidemiologist Tim Leahy says, that's a glass 87% full, but the infection protection drops off considerably. And so that's the focus of why you should get a booster. Some public health people said that shouldn't be the focus, but you can't dictate to the public what their focus is. That's like telling them what their musical taste should be.
Yes, it is.
You have your opinion, and it could be pretty strong, and that's not what people think. right? And so there's the disconnect there between what the public health people are trying to do and what the public is asking for. And Biden says, I get all of that. I'm not an expert, but I'm the commander-in-chief of public health as my role as president, and I'm going to decide which one of these approaches we're going to take, and we're going to go on the side of let's try to decrease the infection rate. And some public health people said, well, the data doesn't support that that's what's going to happen. And other public health people are saying, we don't know that yet. You're saying the data doesn't support it because we don't know, and we're trying to take a proactive position to prevent, and so we're not going to have all the information when we make this decision, and yet a decision has to be made. That's why some of the public health people support what Biden is doing, and other public health people don't. That's not right or wrong. But as often the case in academia, the people who feel that we should wait are absolutely certain they're correct, even in the absence of data, and are telling everybody else what to do and are really mad that you're not listening to them.
Well, that does happen.
So they're more than happy to talk to Politico about an off-the-record thing.
There you go. So that's how that happened, too.
Yeah, and I can name names. I know who they are on Twitter. And they're not necessarily wrong.
Let's do it.
But it's a typical academic, I am absolutely right and you are absolutely wrong, even though there's data to support both positions, and then you get really pissy about it.
Okay, yeah, I do feel like we have seen that before in other contexts. I can think of others that didn't have quite this much riding on it, the decision. But, and I can see how you might go in either direction here. The public certainly is demanding, there's a lot of people who are out there. And I've just anecdotally, I know I've run into people who have just recently contracted COVID. They're fully vaccinated. It's a breakthrough infection, and it's not terrible, and they're making it through just like you were supposed to, given the vaccination. But they're furious. They're just angry. I've done so much. I've given up so much. I've done all the right things. I sacrificed so much. I didn't go to this one's wedding. I didn't go to that one's event. I haven't been to the movies. I haven't been out to dinner. Enough already. And how is it that I can follow all the rules and still get sick? When are they going to get rid of this? That's the general feeling.
It
among
is.
people who are compliant with masks
and in
vaccines.
fact, take the case of parents, right, with kids under 12 who can't get a vaccine. And they're saying, I get that the kids don't normally wind up in the hospital, although a number of them certainly are, but that's not really the driving thing. I just want them not to be sick.
Yeah.
And so if they can't get the vaccine, I certainly want the teachers and staff to not be sick because I don't want the kids to get it from them.
Right.
And I would be really happy if the parents would also get vaccinated so that they don't give it to the kids who would then give it to mine. So, it's why don't you just increase the chance that won't happen? As the political, getting back to that article. Now, even some experts who support the president's broad booster strategy say the White House has fumbled its messaging on the topic, confusing the public as Biden's team tries to limit new surges of infection through the winter. It undermines credibility not just for federal health agencies, but for the administration overall, said Erwin Redlener, director of the Pandemic Resource and Response Initiative at Columbia University. Somebody needs a communication lesson. Many people do.
Well, sure.
So the White House has held regular off-the-record calls, and with FDA preparing to authorize boosters for Moderna and Johnson & Johnson, top federal health officials have reached out to administration surrogates to promote the government's approach, but they haven't reached consensus yet, so they haven't been able to do that. Then they actually get to the article, finally, about the people who agree with Biden. Fauci's remarks drew disagreement on the call because the president's chief medical advisor told the outside experts that boosters could and should be given widely to reduce the spread of the coronavirus rather than only to prevent severe disease or death. That sentence, that one sentence is what I've been talking about for a month on this show.
Yeah.
Finally, somebody's coming out and actually saying it. It turns out it's Tony Fauci. Okay, so I agree with Fauci.
All right. Well,
Sue
good.
me.
Now no, don't. But
Fauci's remarks drew disagreement on the call. The 5 people familiar with the matter said several participants were left mystified about the goal. It was very tense. More than anything, it was like Fauci felt he needed to make a point. Well, that's because they weren't getting it.
Well, then he did need to make a point.
Right? Hours after the Pfizer-BioNTech decision that boosters would be available, Biden predicted the booster shots would be soon available across the board. My opinion, that was a mistake. He shouldn't have said that. That was getting ahead of his skis.
You mean putting a timeline on it?
He might be right, but you just don't say that yet because then it's open to criticism and then everybody says, okay, well, that's confusing because the experts don't really think that it's in the near term.
Okay.
Fauci, Walensky, and other leaders of the administration's COVID response have publicly questioned the FDA and CDC's decision to restrict boosters to the elderly and younger people at high risk by virtue of their jobs or underlying health status. By virtue of their jobs, it opens it up to a lot of people. So I thought that was a nice compromise there. But other people don't agree. And here's some famous names. Here are people I'm friends with and follow on Twitter all the time, many including Celine Gounder, an infectious disease specialist at Bellevue in New York who served on the Biden transitions team, and Megan Ranney, my friend from Rhode Island, who's also a gun control violence expert, an emergency room doctor and associate dean at the School of Public Health at Brown, argue that the U.S. should focus more on convincing holdouts at home to get their initial shots and on shipping more doses overseas. And has another couple of experts who agree with that. Again, you'll see them. They're famous. They're on TV all the time, including Craig Spencer, the guy who took the L train down to Brooklyn when he had Ebola. Right? I mean, but
amazing.
Again,
I still hear about
their
this guy.
focus is you should get the people who haven't got shots, and then you should give other shots to other countries. My perspective, my personal perspective is this doesn't acknowledge the fact that this approach has failed.
True.
If it hadn't failed, then Tennessee would be vaccinated.
Yeah. Right. Convincing the unconvincible. I don't know how much time to put into that.
You keep doing that. That's a second track, but don't think that's the only way, because that's going to take forever. And in the meantime, I want to protect my kid against getting COVID, not winding up in the hospital. I want to prevent my kid from getting COVID. Others say with the pandemic closing in its third year and no end in sight, the administration has to make tough decisions on boosters without full data. William Hazeltine, former HMS Harvard Medical School professor and founder of the university's Cancer and HIV/AIDS Research Department, said those who oppose a broader booster rollout are pitting their hope against the unknown. If you don't have a high level of antibodies, you're relying on immune cell memory. It isn't going to stop you from getting sick. It may prevent you from dying, but it won't stop transmission. They're guessing about how well that's going to work. It's something they'll come to regret. If you're in a situation like we're in right now, is it better to prepare for the worst or prepare for the best? And then, of course, they quote Mike Osterholm somewhere in this also agreeing with that. Part of what we're working out here is how to use the vaccines, and we shouldn't be surprised we don't have all the answers, said Osterholm, an epidemiologist who advised the Biden transition team and supports the booster push. Too many people are viewing this as a luxury dose. It's not. Okay, so that stuff's at the end of the article. The beginning of the article is not everybody agrees, and then they quote the people who think Biden's wrong. And then at the end, but there's a lot of people who think he's right. And again, when you're getting conflicting advice like that, you have to make a decision. And everybody always describes this as confusing. I don't think it's confusing any more than arguing about the budget and the best way to approach reconciliation is confusing. It's different points of views, and they're discussing it in public, and that's perfectly normal, and that's the way democracy is supposed to work. And this is the way science is supposed to work. You make your best point, and other people can argue that the data doesn't support that or it does, and why. And that's the way it's supposed to be. You don't want a bunch of yes men surrounding Biden, but at the same time, in the end, he's the one that's going to have to make the decision. Fauci has a better ear for the public than a lot of the folks who are arguing against it. And I've seen the term ivory tower epidemiologists don't understand what the public wants. There's some truth to that, I'm afraid to say. You could see it in the way that this stuff is covered.
I think it makes it highlights a couple of interesting points, and some of them are maybe less than justifiable, but they're unfortunate truths. Not a lot of people outside of medicine and science are fully aware that, the normal process in medicine and in all sciences is that there are experts in disagreement at all times. They tend to think of medicine and science as sort of monolithic, and this is the decision, and this is the scientific fact, and they get when you say it's not that confusing, but people say they're confused, those are people who are like, I'm confused. My doctor is supposed to be right. What's going on? How could there be other doctors?
It's supposed to be one answer.
Yeah.
People
don't really realize that and take that
That's why I go to church on Sundays, so that my pastor can tell me exactly what's going on, and that's why I'm voting for Trump.
Yeah. Well, right. That's you have to be open to the possibility, of course. Certainly everyone is aware of the idea of getting a second opinion on something very serious, but they generally walk around thinking there is a scientific consensus and a medical consensus, and that's all there is to it, and anybody outside of it is wrong. Or if people inside of it change their minds, they flip out. You change your, then you never knew what was going on.
So you want some detail
masks.
here? So let's say you have 100 doctors and epidemiologists and experts and public health folks, 100 of them. Mm-hmm. What percentage need to agree before you can properly call it a consensus?
Are they senators? 60. But otherwise...
unless it's budget related, in which case it's 51.
But only one day a year.
But, when it comes to climate science, we're talking 90% or more.
Okay.
But you're not going to get 90% of public health people to agree on anything anymore. You're going to get 90% of senators to agree on anything. That's not how it works.
Okay.
You're always going to have the guy who came to the conference and said, I have a question, but it's really a comment more than a question. I heard what you presented, and let me present my own work.
And P.S. horse paste. Right. So, yeah, that's true. Also, I guess another weird situation in deciding whether or not to, say, keep shots here for boosters, and by the way, is there any tension between rolling out the shots to younger kids and boosters for the elderly, or are they the same doses?
Well, boosters for the elderly will be the same doses except when they're not.
Oh.
That is to say, Pfizer's same dose.
Yeah.
Moderna may be a half dose compared to what they did, but that's because Pfizer had 30 micrograms and Moderna had 100. So the booster Moderna may be 50, and so you're getting 250 total, whereas with Pfizer you're getting 90 total, which may be why Moderna works better.
Okay, and why more people seem to have reactions to that one than
And
Pfizer.
Exactly right. They have slightly more reactions, and that I mean slightly, but they have slightly more reactions to Moderna than Pfizer, and it's probably because of the higher dose.
All right. So, I'm not sure then, I guess maybe with Pfizer then...
Can't compare J&J because it's a different mechanism.
Interchangeable, and there's no competition between who gets or I guess it is competition. Whereas in Moderna, the dose is different. These are for boosters for the elderly, not for kids, so they sit over here.
Right, and that's not unusual. Flu shots they make elderly flu shots that are 4 times the dose, and kids get half dose. So that's not surprising. That's one of the things that they have to work out, and that's not confusing. Well, the public's confused because flu doses are different. Well, yes, the public is confused because the dosing on antibiotics is different for babies and 14-year-olds than it is for 45-year-olds.
Horses and
yes.
people. Yeah.
I mean, but that's, what your doctor's supposed to do is figure out the dose. And if you're going to write that as confusing, what you're just saying is, okay, well, I don't have a medical degree.
Yes. Right.
I get that. But, let the pharmacist and your doc figure that out.
It's okay for you to be confused about that. There's plenty of people who aren't. Just ask them.
It's all right to be confused, but that does, it's misleading to say the standard should be people should not be confused about the doses of medication. Well, it's not your job to be, completely expert on the doses of medication. That's somebody else's job.
Right. Your job is take what's in the bottle.
I looked at the inside of an airplane cockpit when the door was open before we took off.
Yes.
There were a lot of controls there. I just found it very confusing.
Right. On the other hand.
Okay, but, the pilot didn't, and that's what's important, not what you think.
Right. But
I'm not using that airline again. I want to go on an airline where it's not confusing.
Oh. Yeah, that's one approach. There's the other one.
Okay, we'll just make sure that the pilot's cockpit door is always closed so you don't get confused.
That's one answer. Now they're locked all the time. There's the New Yorker cartoon, though, out there. The flip side of that same problem, right? Isn't there, the guy standing up and raising his hand and facing the rest of the passengers and saying... who's tired of these elite airline pilots running everything? I think I should fly the plane. Yeah, guys. Okay, great. Well, you'll find it confusing. But on the other,
I saw, and again, the coverage of this is driven by the excellent media reporters. The health reporters are generally very, very good and know what they're doing. And it's quite different when a health reporter has a comment on this than when the politics reporter covering health has a comment on this.
True.
But even the elite health reporters have their own opinions.
Yeah.
And I've seen plenty from excellent elite health reporters saying, well, Biden's obviously playing politics with this. Well, that's kind of a simplistic way of looking at it. You have different views and somebody has to make a decision.
And it is his job. I mean, that's the consideration that is chief on his mind. It's the politics of it. That's why we hired him. Well, yeah. Of course, if it's ever covered, if the issue's ever covered by people who just spent the week covering the Tom Brady return to New England, then yeah, they probably would find it pretty confusing. And isn't it like everyone else does too? We all find it confusing.
What we need is Schoolhouse Rocks. I would love to have somebody, just start the news reporters. This is a complicated situation, but we'll walk you through what's going on here.
Right, and with a cartoon.
Even if you didn't do your report any differently, just starting with that would be a help. To help the public understand that it's not supposed to be simple. Okay. That if the Democrats are coming together with a transformative budget for both infrastructure and domestic policy that's going to have effects not only domestically but around the world internationally.
Because we're America.
Moving past the era of the global war on terror and getting ourselves smack full into the 21st century, that it's not going to be simple. So let's walk you through with what's going on here with this budget reconciliation. And then just do your coverage the way you do your coverage. But starting with that would be so much better than what we get now. Democrats are in disarray because let's talk about what do you think? What did you see about disarray today?
Yeah. Well, I wonder if people would sit through. I guess if there was a cartoon and a song, there's a much better chance that people would sit through it.
But it's the intro. Explain to people that this is complicated. This is going to be complicated. We're doing a complicated thing here. Adults learn by repetition. Just say that every time you start to present the story.
Yeah, right. I mean, there are people who will turn away from complexity, but some people might sit through it, particularly if you can. Well, I guess if there's nothing else on.
But again, what I'm saying is you can not change your coverage one iota, but just tell people that it's complicated before you start it, and we'd still be ahead of the game.
Yes. Also, what is
get people to understand that this is complicated? That's all, and then just do your coverage. Make it as simple as possible. But explain to people this isn't supposed to be simple.
Wait a minute.
It won't work if it's simple.
Did you just
There's no such thing as one dose of medicine for everybody, no matter what body size and age.
The Vox explainers are supposed to do this, and I hate
exactly
those.
Right. You hate them, right?
Well,
but they're not for you. You're a subject matter expert.
Well, yeah, but not on this. I don't know, but I'm not reading it. But well, that's true. That's kind of what they were built to do with those explainers and the little cards that they have, and at the beginning of an article that includes complex concepts. Although I feel like they've gotten away from that a little bit, or maybe I've just gotten so used to it that I don't pay attention to Vox explainers anymore. But that's okay. Interesting. That's a little media criticism mixed in.
Yeah. Anyway, it all goes together because it's all part of
it's complex.
Messaging.
Damn it. Right. That's one other thing. I guess I was wondering about the question of whether or not to send vaccines overseas first or reserve them here for boosters at home. I was thinking maybe another complicating factor or a new and confounding factor is I don't think we've ever been in a situation before where it wasn't A, automatically assumed, and B, largely true, that if there was a global pandemic or some worldwide health threat, that the United States wasn't doing better than everybody else and could afford to target the hot spots around the world with vaccines and aid and help because we were doing okay. And now we're actually one of the worst performing locations on the map, and maybe it makes sense to reserve some of those doses for boosters at home given how poorly we're doing. And although there are lots of poor nations that haven't been able to vaccinate their populations, they also are relatively isolated from the disease, and although it's there, it's not spreading as quickly and disrupting as many lives and killing as many people as we're finding here. We're suddenly we're used to the third world needing this, and maybe we need it before everybody else, or at least alongside everybody else. I don't think we've ever had that before.
All good points. Maybe what we need is like Bill Nye the Science Guy, except on reconciliation.
Oh, well, that could be. Yeah, he's kind of cartoonish.
But keep it simple and explain what's going on.
You got to work on a reconciliation.
So anyway, that's my roundup and rant for today. It's
okay.
It's Wednesday,
right.
But we went through the hour, and now we got to get Abby ready for our sanitation engineer visit. Okay.
Well, it's that time again, and
she hasn't been on the air for a while, but we've been trying to be good about having her outside.
Yeah, okay, right. I haven't heard it in a while, and I don't think I don't know. Are they late every Wednesday? No, can't be.
No. She's outside. They're outside, so you can't hear anything going on.
Oh, nicely done. All right, very good. And thanks. We'll catch up tomorrow. We're just about at the top of our hour here, and I was just checking the Twitter feed, but I see you've caught already Mad Hatter asking, what was it, for Robert Krulwich?
Yeah, NPR's Radiolab guy. He's pretty good at explaining science stuff. And actually, he's also hosted a series of discussions on science at the 92nd Street Y, where, tries to explain to the public what's going on. So you need good explainers. They do exist. You should be featured. But again, just my point is it's helpful for the public to understand that it is complicated, and that doesn't mean that there's always one right opinion. The other issue, and I've said this on the show before, that they will eventually get to, but they haven't done a very good job of explaining, is what natural immunity means and where people fit in if you've had the virus already, and what that means in terms of getting a booster. Nobody's talking about it. They need to.
Yeah, I guess so. Right. And then that would make sense.
In fact, the more people that get COVID, the more relevant that discussion is for them in their lives.
And there are a lot. And we're coming up on 45 million that we know of in this country alone, which is a pretty significant chunk of our population. Okay, well, thank you. We've certainly filled our hour, and we'll check in with you tomorrow for anything that you forgot. There's more, of course, because it's complex. That much you've told us. We will catch you tomorrow. Okay.
Well, that's today's rant.
Yep. Well,
you got me started.
That's the idea. That way you can say you enjoyed the show. Okay.
I did. I loved it.
Very good.
At least the first time.
I talked the whole time. It was fantastic.
I didn't get enough airtime.
Hey, come back tomorrow. Sorry. All right.
I'll see you.
See you tomorrow. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's see. Where to go next? Well, a few tidbits to share with you, and then a couple of items that have come across the Twitter transom in the last hour or so. Right at the beginning of the show when we were discussing the debt limit and the filibuster situation, Paul Waldman adding this comment to the mix that I thought was worth sharing, and therefore did so on Twitter. Now on the radio, maybe someone can ask Joe Manchin to lay out the affirmative case for keeping the filibuster, or an affirmative case for why increasing the debt ceiling itself should remain subject to a filibuster. That's a good question, right? Why should something like that be subject to a filibuster? And as he says, it's not like Manchin, can say, well, we need to come together and craft wise bipartisan debt ceiling increases. It just needs to be raised. So why not do it? Now, that's a great comment and a great insight on the thing, right? What's Manchin's position on the filibuster? He keeps insisting that the filibuster fosters bipartisan compromise rather than prevents it. I mean, like most things, it does a little bit of both. But, of course, he means the fact that you would need to have votes from both sides in order to get past a filibuster means that getting past a filibuster, well, there you have it. I mean, it's right on its face. It requires bipartisan cooperation at some level, and that without the filibuster, you could possibly just ram everything you want through on party line votes, except we're all watching that not happen now. Because there's always some dissenters among the parties. But although he is pretty clear where he says if you want to be able to do that, you're going to need to be electing more liberal Democratic senators from around the country, and just go do that. Of course, it's awfully difficult to do when, the votes, the weight of the popular vote for liberal Democrats to represent them in the Senate is undone by our system of electing senators by states, etc. So that's kind of unfortunate. We're limited in that way. But anyway, just to stick to what Manchin has to say. Manchin, of the belief that leaving the filibuster in place requires bipartisan compromise of some sort. And, he has the germ of a point in there on that one. On the other hand, as we've seen, well, the filibuster exists, so why? And it's being used a lot, so why isn't it resulting in tons of bipartisan compromise? There's also that. And as Paul puts it here, no compromise appears to be forthcoming, and they are insistent on telling people publicly, telling the reporters who are covering the situation that they don't want to compromise. They have no position, they have no interest in anything at least on this question, although lots of people think it they have no interest in any positions on anything, no policy positions of any kind. But as Paul's pointing out here, what bipartisan compromise really would you need to craft as between Republicans and Democrats on the question of whether or not the debt ceiling should be raised or suspended? I mean, I guess you could fight over what number to put on it, but since all anybody wants to really do is suspend the thing, it's a question of shall we suspend it or shall we not? So there's not a lot of gray area to work things out, right? This is a point that was made a while back in what would be our, generation's original fight on filibuster reform. And they realized the truth of it and ended up eliminating the filibuster for judicial appointments and for executive appointments because they got to the point where, they got to the point of frustration where they just said, we can't make the rest of the government work anymore. So it's either maintain the filibuster or destroy the government piece by piece, which the Republicans were probably fine with and Democrats weren't. So they said, let's appoint some judges. And the same logic applies. This is the name of the person who's been nominated to this seat. You either support that person or you oppose that person. There isn't bipartisan compromise that can be reached about what this person's judicial philosophy will be going forward. It's theirs, and the Senate can't change it. So there's no deal that can be reached as to, what kind of person ought to occupy this seat. This is the nominee. You either, meet with your approval or they don't, and you got to choose one or the other. There's no compromise to be hashed out. You can't make a hybrid person and put them in that seat. So what's the filibuster for? Extended debate about this person? We're not even doing that anymore. We're not having any debate. I mean, what did the filibuster of Merrick Garland's appointment to the Supreme Court get anybody in terms of added insight into his qualifications for the job? There wasn't any extended debate on it. There was none. They blocked it all. They didn't even allow senators to prepare for a debate by visiting with Judge Garland at the time. So anyway, I think a good point from Paul there, right? Either raise or get the debt ceiling out of the way or don't. There isn't any compromise to be reached. So what the hell are we having extended debate for, and why do we have to filibuster the thing? Not to mention the fact that of what's at stake and how dangerous it could be if the debt ceiling were not raised or suspended. So I think a good point there on that one. And let's see, the other thing that just came across the transom here, and I saw something earlier this morning on a similar note. So let's see. Our friend Der Wouter Vanderhorst sends along this comment. Has anybody looked at Trump's paperwork? Let's see. Okay. I see what this is about. You know, me and my doubts about Trump's paperwork. He's passing along the tweet of Hugo Lowell. Who is Hugo Lowell? He is a congressional reporter for The Guardian U.S., the UK paper, but the U.S. version, I guess, of The Guardian. He's got a scoop. He says, source tells me Trump White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows and top aides Scavino, Bannon, and Patel are set to defy January 6th committee subpoenas under instructions from Trump. So perhaps we can take a look at that story. But I guess we figured this was coming. And I understand that the subpoenas have a response date on them. I think of Friday. I believe I saw as part of one or another of the exchanges between Greg Sargent and Jamie Raskin that Friday is the deadline. And Raskin was out there saying, you know, I strongly advise, you know, you to comply with the subpoenas, as though they were going to listen to him. I saw also this morning via Twitter that Scavino, in particular, is, I guess, set to not to comply. He has maybe a better shot at getting away with non-compliance. He hasn't been served with his subpoena, apparently, because he's in hiding, or at least they haven't been able to find him. I'm sure eventually they will find him, and he'll say, I wasn't hiding. You just didn't know where I was, and that's on you, not me. I wasn't hiding from you, but we'll see whether facts bear that out in the end. But I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. If he is hiding, I mean, he probably thinks that's a clever game. I can't respond to the subpoena, and I can't, you know, and most times the courts will say, well, if you haven't been served, then I don't know. But I guess if you're a fugitive and avoiding service, I don't know how tolerant they are of that. I just thought that was interesting. Like, nothing much to see here, right? Just the former guy's deputy chief of staff at the White House, a fugitive from justice in an investigation of the insurrection. Now, basically, he should be considered to be, wherever they find him, you should just say it was a spider hole and pull him out of there. And you know what happens to guys that are found in spider holes when they've been hiding from us. Well, anyway, I doubt very much that will happen. Let me see the Guardian's take on the story. Top Trump aides set to defy subpoenas in Capitol attack investigation. I imagine this is Trump telling them, well, I'm going to assert executive privilege to block you from testifying. And there will be a, I think, relatively brief court battle about that, which it appears he's poised to lose, as he does with most of his cases. Then it'll just be a question of, I don't care what the court says about executive privilege. That was my first line defense, but I never intended to testify, period. Executive privilege or not. Now it's a question of, can you make me? And it'll be up to the Congress to decide as between the old chestnut of inherent contempt, which they probably won't go with. Now, though, if they can get these, keep the ball rolling and get it done here while there's still a Democratic administration, then at least they would have a Democratic president's appointee as U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, which is who they'd presumably use, although not all of those people are necessarily under the jurisdiction of the District of Columbia anymore. But hand it to a U.S. attorney somewhere, presumably one appointed by or approved, at any rate, by the Biden administration, and they would prosecute the contempt of Congress charge. It's only a serious problem when it's the current chief executive defying those orders because they can, or I guess a chief executive of the same party these days, since we're so tribal, they can order, you know, or wink, wink at the U.S. attorneys and say, use your prosecutorial discretion to not prosecute this case. But in this case, they might have a rough go of it. So where were we here? Right at the beginning. Who wrote it? Hugo Lowell, right? He not only tweeted it, he wrote it. The former Trump White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows and other top aides subpoenaed by the House Select Committee investigating the Capitol attack are expected to defy orders for documents and testimony related to 6 January, or January 6th, as we say, according to a source familiar with the matter. I'm glad they did ask a source familiar with it, because the sources that have no idea are terrible. The move to defy the subpoenas would mark the first major investigative hurdle faced by the Select Committee and threatens to touch off an extended legal battle as the former president pushes some of his most senior aides to undercut the inquiry. I just had a huge, New Jersey accent moment there, if you call it that. It's not just to threaten to touch off an extended, but touch off. It's very different. Touch off an extended legal battle. All four Trump aides, if you want to emphasize that, targeted by the Select Committee: Meadows, Deputy Chief of Staff Dan Scavino, strategist Steve Bannon, another one of the fired, not fired guys, right? And Defense Department aide Kash Patel. He's moved all over the place. I think didn't he start with what's his name, Devin Nunes, and then move around from place to place. They kept putting him anywhere they wanted to destroy the underlying infrastructure of the executive branch. Anyway, those four, Meadows, Scavino, Bannon, Patel, are expected to resist the orders because Trump is preparing to direct them to do so, the source said. The Select Committee had issued the subpoenas under threat of criminal prosecution in the event of noncompliance, warning that the penalty for defying a congressional subpoena would be far graver under the Biden administration than during the Trump presidency. That's good news. But increasingly concerned with the far-reaching nature of the January 6th investigation, Trump and his legal team, led by the ex-Trump campaign lawyer Justin Clark, the former White House counsel Patrick Philbin, yes. What? I don't even know. The Trump and his legal team, led by, right, Justin Clark and Patrick Philbin, are moving to instruct the attorneys for the subpoenaed aides to defy the orders. The basis for Trump's pressing aides not to cooperate, or to not cooperate, is being mounted on the grounds of executive privilege, the source said, over claims that sensitive conversations about what he knew in advance of plans to stop the certification of Joe Biden's election victory should remain secret. By the way, they should not, for several reasons, not the least of which is the one we've discussed before. Executive privilege no longer trumps to grant, though it has been the case that current presidents very frequently will invoke it on behalf of previous former presidents in the hopes that they would get the same courtesy in the future, and just that generally, as between administrations, even though they're adversaries and sometimes ran against one another and displaced one another and are, of course, of different tribes, politically speaking, that there's usually a general recognition that serious people usually are the ones occupying the presidency, and it pays to offer the same courtesy across administrations, whereas this administration seems to have been different in kind, and of course, on top of all of that, the activity is different in kind, a quantum difference in the kinds of activities here. Do you protect the privilege as it applied to the George W. Bush administration? In some cases, yes. In some cases, I would argue no. But at least there's some yeses where I say, okay, occasionally they conducted themselves as a serious administration. Not always the case in matters surrounding the so-called global war on terror, etc., and domestic surveillance connected to that. But in other issue areas, you can sometimes say that they approached things seriously. Almost never the case for the Trump administration. And if it was, it was like overt Trump policy to declare frequently that they were operating outside of the Washington consensus when it comes to how to handle government. Well, now that we're back inside the Washington consensus ought to be that people operating outside the Washington consensus aren't protected. That's the risk of operating outside the Washington consensus. You knew that going in. You either have to win forever and abolish the Washington consensus, as Bannon would have us do, or accept the consequences that if we ever return to the Washington consensus, you will be held to account by the Washington consensus, because that's what, the conventional wisdom and the Washington consensus does. It preserves itself. That's why you wanted to smash it, but you failed. That's the way coups go. Win or die in most of history. To this point, unfortunately, we haven't been seriously considering the die part for the losers in all of this. And that's just because we're so magnanimous and generous. It's American exceptionalism. We love losers. Okay. Anyway, let me jump back to the article instead of doing a philosophical piece, though we'll probably peel off a little bit later on, too. The basis, again, for Trump's pressing aides not to cooperate, executive privilege. This, basically, again, I'll just read what they say in the article here and emphasize it. The source, so grounds of executive privilege overclaims that the sensitive conversations about what he knew in advance of the plans to stop the certification of Joe Biden's election victory should remain secret. Why? Because it was the operation of states. The operations of state that this was, an official action being taken by the President of the United States, and so therefore. But remember that it's an official action of the President of the United States to undermine and overthrow the constitutional government of the United States. Not in the job description. An ultra vires action, if there ever was one. So I don't know if they're going to find a lot of agreement among, I know they'll find agreement probably among Trump judges, maybe. But no help in the Biden White House, and no help, therefore, in the Office of Legal Counsel, and then a memo will be issued, and you know what we do with those. But you know what Trump people do with memos, too. They don't like them, they throw them out. Philbin appears less convinced than Trump about the strength of the legal argument, the source said. I think he's right. In part because the Justice Department previously declined to assert their protection for January 6th testimony, already, suggesting it did not exist to protect Trump's personal interests. That's true. Again, he couldn't possibly, by definition, wasn't functioning as the President of the United States when he had those conversations. The President of the United States upholds, supports, and defends the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. If he was acting otherwise, it was in contravention of his oath and clearly outside of his role as president, particularly as he seeks to destroy the presidency and replace it with a personal dictatorship. Anyway, the former president's lawyer, Philbin, the source said, instead seems to view the strategy more as an effective way to slow walk the Select Committee, which is aiming to produce a final report before the 2022 midterm elections to keep the inquiry nonpartisan. It was not clear on Tuesday whether Trump would push aides to defy all elements of the subpoena, the source cautioned. Access to some emails or call records demanded by the Select Committee might be waived. But Trump's strategy mirrors the playbook he used to prevent House Democrats from deposing his top advisors during his presidency. The former White House counsel, Don McGahn, for instance, only testified to Congress about the Mueller inquiry once Trump left office. House Select Committee investigators had demanded that the four Trump aides turn over emails, call records, and other documents related to the Capitol attack by Thursday, not Friday, Thursday, and then appear before the panel for a closed-door deposition next week. But with the former president expected to insist to Philbin that Meadows, Scavino, Bannon, and Patel mount blanket refusals against the subpoenas, the source said, the Select Committee at present appears likely to see none of the requests fulfilled. The move means that House Select Committee investigators now face the key decision over how to enforce the orders and whether they make a criminal referral to the Justice Department after the Thursday deadline for documents or next week's crunch date for testimony. The House Select Committee Chairman, Benny Thompson, told reporters recently that he was prepared to pursue criminal referrals to witnesses who defied subpoenas and subpoena deadlines as the panel escalates the pace of the evidence-gathering part of its investigation. We'll do whatever the law allows us to do, Thompson said last Friday on the subject of prosecuting recalcitrant witnesses. For those who don't agree to come in voluntarily, we'll do criminal referrals. So we'll see how long those take. I hope they move them speedily. Better odds now that the Biden administration is in charge on that. But yeah, you can see where Philbin's going. I don't think it ultimately works to assert executive privilege, but it does force them to fight that out in court, and we can drag that out. And how long can we drag it out? One thing we could do is try to drag it out so that the investigations are still ongoing during the 2022 elections, on the theory that people will see them as partisan overreach and react against Democrats who historically would ordinarily be expected to lose seats as the in party at the White House in the next midterm election, but we'll see whether that applies, the historical standard, or not. Plenty of reasons to believe that it wouldn't. Besides which, remember that the whole point of the Trump administration, even when they're out of power, is to keep us outside of the Washington consensus. So, okay, let's stay outside of the Washington consensus on what happens during midterm elections. The other thing to keep in mind is they could also be thinking about stretching this way, way, way the hell out. I mean, you can make the clock run 4 years instead of 2, and maybe the bet is I'll be running again in 2024 if he's actually healthy enough to do that, and become president again and make the whole thing go away that way. Or the next Republican will do it on my behalf in order to have access to my donor and support base. Entirely possible. They may just be thinking a Republican president would make this go away, even if it's not us. Incredibly dangerous. And a repeat of the same goddamn thing over and over again, and I'm a little bit sick of it too. All right, Thompson says we'll do whatever the law allows us to do. I hope they do, and do it quickly. A spokesperson for the Select Committee declined to comment about how the panel intended to secure compliance. That's a key question, so of course they won't answer it. The legal battle to force some of Trump's most senior White House aides to comply with the subpoenas, however it's manifested, is likely to lead to constitutional clashes in court that will test the power of Congress's oversight authority over the executive branch, which I thought we've done 100 times and settled already, but I guess not. But members of the Select Committee in recent days have expressed quiet optimism, at least about the potential prosecution of witnesses who might defy subpoenas, in part because of the Biden administration's public support for the investigation. The Select Committee said in the subpoena letters to Meadows, Bannon, Scavino, and Patel that they were key persons of interest over what they knew about the extent of Trump's involvement on the Capitol attack, which left 5 dead and more than 140 injured. Meadows, the former White House chief of staff, remains of special interest to House Select Committee investigators since he was involved in efforts to subvert the results of the 2020 election and remained by Trump's side as rioters stormed the Capitol in his name. He was also in contact with Patel at the Defense Department, the Select Committee asserted, and communicated with members of the Women for America First group that planned the so-called Stop the Steal rally that deteriorated into the January 6th insurrection. Scavino, the former White House deputy chief of staff, became a person of interest after it emerged that he met with Trump the day before the Capitol attack to discuss how to persuade members of Congress not to certify the election, according to his subpoena letter. The Select Committee said the subpoena letter to Bannon that they wanted to hear from Trump's former chief strategist, who was present at the Willard Hotel on January 5th to strategize with Trump campaign officials how to stop the election certification. Patel, meanwhile, is under scrutiny since he was involved in Pentagon discussions about security at the Capitol before and after the riot. The Select Committee added that they were also examining reports that Trump tried to install him as deputy CIA director. Don't forget about that one. So, lots of constitutional fun yet to come on this. And really, things would probably be evolving a lot differently if, like I said, people who retreat to spider holes get hanged. Outcome's different. I think. Maybe not. Okay. Let's see. Other things to toss into the mix here. Oh, I want to check back on Twitter and just make sure I'm not missing anything else. I should just read you Twitter over and over and forget trying to select stories for the show myself. Okay, let's see. Oh, yeah. This is perhaps of some interest, given that we were just talking about the January 6th thing. Long article. Don't know if we really need to read the whole thing, and of course we will bump into our break that'll make it impossible. Oh, but not to mention the firewall, but the LA Times reporting yesterday. I got one look at it. Now I can look at it in pocket. Interesting question arises about the mechanics of January 6th. January 6th rioters exploited little-known Capitol weak spots, a handful of unreinforced windows. Sarah Wire appears to be the writer on this one. Is that actually the case when I flip through? It won't show me. Okay. Well, like I said, we run up against our break, but I'll give you a taste of what's going on here. 4 major access points that January 6th rioters used to break into and overtake the U.S. Capitol had something unusual in common. They were among a dozen or so ground floor windows and glass-paned doors that had not been recently reinforced. The majority of the Capitol's 658 single-pane windows were quietly upgraded during a 2017 to 2019 renovation of the historic building. The original wooden frames and glass were covered with a second metal frame containing bomb-resistant glass. But there were a couple of them, for various reasons, I'll continue with the story in just a couple of minutes, that weren't replaced, and they found them all.
Hi everyone, it's me, Gil. Minimal contributor to content, but regular contributor to funding for Kagro in the morning. Let's change things up from David's so very tired plea for your contributions with a plea of my own. If you want to add your voice to the show, do it. Record your own segment using your favorite recording device and send it to David. Read an article and give your opinion. Write your own essay and read that. The sky's the limit. Well, not really. Try to keep it relatively short so David doesn't have to stress about cutting it and hurting your feelings. Join the hallowed ranks of Greg Dworkin and Joan McCarter and be part of this somewhat witty deep dive into political topics with unnecessary censoring. Lend your voice to the show by sending it to kagrox@gmail.com. KAGROX@gmail.com.
Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Boy, oh boy. Okay, plenty to continue with here, but as I mentioned, I have to read the pocket version of this because you only get one shot at looking at the LA Times story, and I looked at it. Damn. Now I have to read this. So, we were just saying that weird little mystery, and it's not clear exactly how it happened, and there are many explanations for it, but as it happens, the January 6th rioters just happened to find all of the ground floor windows in the Capitol complex, under a dozen of them out of almost 650, 700 such windows and doors to not be replaced. They managed to find each of them and breach them. So, what's up with this? As we were saying, back in 2017 through 19, there was a big renovation of the entire Capitol complex, and the Capitol's 658 single-pane windows quietly upgraded with bomb-resistant glass, but the planners of that renovation skipped about a dozen ground floor windows, including some located on doors, because they were deemed to be, well, for one thing, low risk in the event of implosion. That is, they were contemplating bomb attack and thought, well, these are at low risk of shattering in the event of such an attack, largely due to their discreet or shielded location, or because the building couldn't structurally handle the load of heavier frames. Now, how does it happen? Well, whether by sheer luck, real-time trial and error, or advanced knowledge by rioters, which is what some people suspected, right when members were allegedly seen giving tours to groups of people who ended up actually attending not only Trump's speech and rally, but the riot itself the next day. And people wondered what kind of reconnaissance is going on here. That could be it. Although I suspect, I will say this, that the members who were suspected of giving such tours probably just never had any opportunity to figure out the logistics of the building like that. I mean, a few of them were longer term members, but people like Lauren Boebert, where would she have gotten the information? I guess it's possible that someone who did have it might have given it to her and then used her to convey it to would-be rioters. But the other equally likely explanation is a mob descends on the Capitol, surrounds it, and everybody starts smashing at every window they can find. Most of them don't give in because they've been reinforced, but some do because they have not been reinforced. And they're in discreet or hidden locations, but remember, people are filling every nook and cranny trying to smash their way in, and lo and behold, over the course of a couple hours, they find the dozen or so unreinforced windows. I don't think it's that unlikely that could have been the case. So as they say, whether by sheer luck, real-time trial and error, or advanced knowledge by rioters, several of those vulnerable windows, I guess not all of them, and 2 glass-paned doors, protected with only a thin Kevlar film added after the September 11th terrorist attacks, became easy entry points for hundreds of Trump supporters who overran and ransacked the building on January 6th. Video shows some of the first rioters to break through the police line, running past 15 reinforced windows and making a beeline for a recessed area on the Senate side of the building where 2 unreinforced windows and 2 doors with unreinforced glass were all that stood between them and the hallways leading to lawmakers inside who had not yet begun to evacuate. That's a bit suspicious. Why running past 15 windows and into this obscure side entrance? A rioter's fist cracked the glass of one window. Video posted to social media shows a stolen police riot shield and a wooden pole finished the job. In seconds, the unreinforced glass gave way in a single sheet. Rioters poured through the window. Similar methods were used to break glass in at least 3 other locations. I couldn't believe that they were able to breach those points as easily as they did, said Scott Lilly, a former House Appropriations Committee Democratic staff director. It certainly shows that all the money and inconvenience we've instituted on these buildings was not particularly well spent. Though the bomb-resistant windows were never designed to keep out rioters, every reinforced window that was attacked by insurrectionists appears to have remained intact, even if damaged. But despite the unintended effectiveness of bomb-resistant windows as a deterrent against attackers on foot, it remains unclear whether the board responsible for Capitol security will now upgrade those remaining single-pane windows and unreinforced doors. My guess is that they will, in some way. The access points that rioters passed through have so far been repaired with single-pane glass, but without Kevlar. Officials indicated they plan to use some of the $300 million Congress approved this summer for security improvements to upgrade windows broken on January 6th. I wonder, by the way, if the supply chain for reinforced glass breaks down or has broken down between now and then. The windows that were broken on January 6th are obviously a key area of focus, Senate Sergeant-at-Arms Karen Gibson said in a statement. A House Administration Committee aide said, an engineering review will determine what updates are possible considering the weight of the ballistic glass. They're very old windows, the aide said. For decades, Capitol security officials and lawmakers were focused on an entirely different threat. By the way, it would be a shame if the January 6th rioters were behind our having to replace, like historically correct or even original windows in the Capitol building with something modern and ugly, but safer. But I don't think they care about that. Anyway, for decades, Capitol security officials and lawmakers were focused on an entirely different threat. The millions of dollars spent to harden the Capitol after the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, the 1998 shooting of 2 Capitol police officers at an entrance checkpoint, and September 11th, all have been targeted at protecting the highest number of lives in case of bomb or explosion. Nobody ever talked about the potential of an insurrection and thousands of people storming the Capitol, said former architect of the Capitol, Alan Hantman, who held the role from 1997 to 2007. Yeah, I don't think that was ever discussed. After September 11th, 2001, of course, the FBI warned lawmakers that as many as 35,000 employees could die from flying glass shards if a bomb in a truck went off outside the building. Wow, that'd be a lot from glass. Former House Appropriations Republican Staff Director Jim Dyer said, Congress quickly approved $100 million to install concrete barriers and apply Kevlar film on thousands of windows in the Capitol and its surrounding office buildings. The FBI said the film could reduce casualties by 80% because it would cause the glass to break in a single sheet. Years later, in 2017, the Capitol complex underwent another security renovation that included motion sensors on the Capitol lawn and the bomb-resistant glass. Those upgrades were part of a well-publicized, large-scale renovation to the exterior stone and ironwork of the Capitol and surrounding office buildings, but the security improvements were not widely disclosed at the time. Most of the Capitol was covered in scaffolding during the multi-year project, and much of the work took place at night. Funding to reinforce the windows came from a mix of classified and unclassified appropriations, which helped mask the scale and cost of the project. The bomb-resistant frames, which sit about 4 inches outside the existing single-pane window frames, were carefully designed to look like the originals so that they would not be immediately noticeable to the general public. According to a former Capitol Architects staff member who was employed when the decision was made but did not want to be identified, speaking about the security matter, the decisions about which windows and doors would not be reinforced were based on calculations of how many people might be killed or injured by imploding glass in the event of a bomb outside, the former staff member said. Some second and third floor windows were not upgraded due to estimates of the low risk to those windows from a bomb's likely blast radius and direction, according to several Capitol staff members familiar with the plans. Other factors included how many people were in regular proximity to a particular window, giving priority to offices over hallways. Another consideration was whether a window was in an area that a person with a bomb could freely access by vehicle or by foot, staff members said. The final call on which windows to upgrade fell to a 3-member Capitol Police Board made up of the Architect of the Capitol, the House Sergeant-at-Arms, and the Senate Sergeant-at-Arms. Congress oversees the board, though it has operated largely autonomously for years, until recently when questions arose over the failure to fend off the January 6th attack. When asked about the decision not to reinforce certain windows, a spokesperson for the Architect of the Capitol said upgrades are made in consultation with security officials and details are not released to ensure physical security of the campus is not compromised. Most of the unreinforced glass broken on January 6th was on the west front of the Capitol, where much of the hours-long battle between officers and rioters took place. Some of the windows and doors they attacked were just yards from where presidential inaugurations take place. Separating that side of the building from the nearest road is a sprawling lawn and a wide terrace that has been largely off limits to the public for years, which may explain why glass there was not upgraded. The area is normally patrolled by Capitol Police carrying assault-style weapons. The 4 unreinforced windows and doors that were the first points of entry on January 6th are all in a recessed alcove shielded by exterior walls on 3 sides. They were not the first windows nor the easiest to reach for rioters storming up the Capitol steps. Attackers ran more than 100 feet across a courtyard to reach the covered outdoor entryway where 2 unreinforced windows and one of the doors are. The east front, considered the main entrance to the building, is more accessible to the public. Protesters and tourists often gather in its wide plaza. It is more heavily fortified, with nearly every window on the first and second floors reinforced. 2 of the 3 breaches on that side of the building occurred through doors. 1 second-floor window was also smashed in. A House Select Committee investigating January 6th has been tasked with probing what led to the riot, of course, and how it occurred, including how rioters so easily penetrated the building. A committee spokesman said investigators need to understand everything on that day, but he did not comment on whether the unreinforced windows are part of their inquiry. But instead, they're part of ours. So, worth noting, and an interesting bit about the process by which they decided to make the replacements. So I added a little bit of kept going through the detail of that one too. All right, let's see. Maybe a bit more detail available now with regard to filibuster reform thoughts. Although, I think we've really covered it by bringing up the rather extreme thoughts. But The Hill reported on it earlier this morning, I think, or maybe last night even. Senate Democrats float filibuster carve-out for debt ceiling. So just, more people on the record talking about it. Dick Durbin talking about it. Chris Murphy, who I mentioned already. Ben Cardin, I guess, adds that I'll read a little bit of this, adds he personally supports changes to the 60-vote filibuster rule, but deferred to leadership about if he thought Democrats could win over Manchin and Sinema. So that's the remaining question. Any other people mentioned in here? Well, here's some discussion of Manchin. Democrats have been under growing pressure to nix the legislative filibuster, with the stalemate with Republicans over how to raise the debt ceiling pouring new fuel into those calls. But Manchin indicated to reporters on Monday that he didn't view gutting the filibuster as connected to the fight over the debt ceiling. The filibuster has nothing to do with the debt ceiling. Basically, we have other tools that we can use, and if we have to use them, we should use them, Manchin said on Monday. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. The White House quickly beginning to rule out various possibilities. $1 trillion coin possibility, not a favorite there. 14th Amendment overruling of the debt ceiling, not a huge favorite there either. Reconciliation, a possibility, but it's beginning to look like we would run out of time, and the vote-a-rama could be stretched out. By the time we got the thing written and brought it to the floor, and it was, and getting past motions to proceed, et cetera, and working it in both houses, and then having it end up in the Senate, and a vote-a-rama comes up. By the time they got to vote-a-rama, they might literally be able to stretch out a vote-a-rama past October 18th. So increasingly looking like reconciliation might not be the way either, at least this time. Let's see. Anything else? Asked about his Democratic colleagues creating an exemption for the filibuster for the debt ceiling, Manchin on Tuesday evening pointed to Senate leadership. They got to work through it. Let the leaders work it out. They should work it out. Just go work it out. They both know what this country needs, Manchin told reporters on Tuesday. So that's not an answer. And it sounds like, to me, that sounds like he might, up against the wall on the 18th and no reconciliation bill in sight, might just say, all right, what the hell? I'll go along with it. But they're going to have to tailor it really narrowly in order to get his agreement. And who knows what Sinema does? I mean, maybe she goes along just out of the same spirit of there's really nothing else to be done here. Okay. Related issues, I guess we can, let's see, there's a couple of things I want to read to you here. We'll see how many of them we can squeeze in. The Hill also reporting this news, and this is more related than the next thing that I'll try to squeeze in. 92 legal scholars call on Harris, that would be Vice President Harris, to preside over Senate to include immigration in reconciliation. So the call for Vice President Harris in her role as President of the Senate to not overrule the parliamentarian so much as ignore the parliamentarian and issue her own ruling on the ability to include the immigration provisions in reconciliation. I think we're on to like Plan D here for that, but that's always been discussed and always been an option that DFH activists, dirty effing hippies, and stupid bloggers have been calling for. But now 92 legal scholars are calling for it, so it's okay. I mean, and they'll be the ones that get credited for it, not you dirty, stupid hippies. A group of legal scholars from around the country, that's the game, we're used to it by now, from around the country called on Vice President Harris and Senate Democratic leadership to include immigration protections in the reconciliation package, despite the Senate parliamentarians' ruling or advice against the move. The 92 scholars called on Harris, Senate Majority Leader Charles Chuck Schumer, and Senate President Pro Tem Pat Leahy to overrule, and that's in quotes, parliamentarian Elizabeth McDonough, whose rulings are non-binding, so you don't need to overrule her, but for the presiding officer instead to issue a ruling contrary to her advice. As you know, and as you know, listening, the vice president serves as presiding officer when she is in attendance, and the president pro tempore, or his designate, serves as presiding officer at other times, wrote the scholars. At issue is language that McDonough ruled on September 19th that's what it says, incompatible with the rules of budget reconciliation bills. That language, if enacted into law, would have allowed the federal government to offer legal permanent residency to around 8 million undocumented immigrants and immigrants on humanitarian parole programs who are not currently eligible to apply for permanent residency. McDonough said such a move would be a substantial change in policy and would be extraneous to the strictly budgetary requirements known as the Byrd Rule, limiting which provisions can be included in a reconciliation bill. When determining whether a provision is extraneous, the presiding officer may rely on the Senate parliamentarian for expert advice, wrote the scholars. However, as past parliamentarians have emphasized, the ultimate decision on a point of order lies with the presiding officer, subject to appeal to the full Senate. The presiding officer, therefore, must exercise her own judgment in deciding whether a provision should be stricken from a budget reconciliation bill on Byrd Rule grounds. Reconciliation would allow Democrats to sidestep a Republican filibuster, and many immigration advocates believe the current political climate grants a unique opportunity for reform on the issue, which might not repeat itself in years. While immigration provisions have not been at the center of intra-party debate on the reconciliation bill, groups of Democrats in the House and Senate have fought to include immigration in the bill. McDonough has so far struck down 2 separate proposals to grant legal permanent residency through relatively vague memoranda, among other things, arguing that permanent status would have such non-budgetary impacts as to outweigh its budgetary effects. The scholars wrote that the parliamentarian cannot make a final authoritative determination on that point, that only the presiding officer of the full Senate on appeal can do so. To defeat any appeal through the presiding officer's ruling, Senate Democrats would need 51 votes, meaning Harris would have to be present and presiding over the Senate to cast the tie-breaking vote. Let's see. I'm not certain that that's actually the case. It may be that if she were to rule, we've discussed this in the past, and I think there's some difference of opinion again here, or maybe this is just bad, faulty reporting. And with things being so complicated, it does happen. But we've discussed in the past the possibility that if Harris were to rule in favor of including the immigration provisions in reconciliation, that an appeal of the ruling of the chair in the reconciliation context would require 60 votes to overturn. Not that it would require 51 to sustain it necessarily, but rather 60 to overturn it. So some fine differences there. And the scholars argue, going back to the article here, the budgetary effects of granting legal permanent residency status to millions of people would be more than substantial. That's, you could argue that. The outlay and revenue effects of extending LPR status, legal permanent resident status, to 8 million people are sweeping. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that the budgetary effect of the LPR provisions would be $140 billion over the next 10 years, more than the entire effect of some statutes enacted through budget reconciliation in the past, they wrote. The scholars listed a series of social programs and taxes that would be directly affected by granting the status to a large population, from the Affordable Care Act to increases in tax revenues from workers with better salaries. Although the Byrd Rule does not allow for provisions with a merely incidental effect on the budget, the scholars argue that the scope of a broad legalization package would have a direct and substantial effect on the federal budget. And I understand that. And I even agree that it's a substantial impact. It's just a question of how direct it is. I mean, if you're arguing the case of the parliamentarian here, look, this isn't chiefly fiscal policy. It has fiscal effects. Everything does. Everything does. And sometimes they're huge. But the chief aim here is granting legal status, not tinkering with the budget. You're not, and it could be argued anyway, that you're not granting legal resident status to these people for the budgetary impact. You're granting it because it's the right thing to do, and you believe in providing a path to citizenship for these folks. And that's fine, and it's a good enough reason, and it doesn't it isn't budgetary, and it shouldn't be budgetary. And to claim that it is an obvious ruse. But, what do I care? Obvious ruse. It's fine. We're all doing obvious ruses now. Obvious ruse going on the debt ceiling from the Republicans. We'll do an obvious ruse too. Why not? The scholars listed a series of social programs and taxes that would be directly affected by granting the status to a large population. Great, but not relevant in my view. Although the Byrd Rule doesn't allow for provisions that are merely incidental effects on the budget, right? Oh, I think we read all of that. Anyway, we see no basis in law or precedent for concluding that these outlay-related effects are merely incidental to legal permanent resident status. Access to health insurance, home ownership, affordable rental housing. All these are great things, but, ultimately, I disagree with the reasoning, but I want to go along with the plan anyway. Just to be perfectly clear. By the way, so let's see. The group includes former Democratic Senator Russ Feingold, if that's of interest to you. And as we said, 91 other legal scholars. The text of the letter is in the Hill piece, and you can read the whole thing if you want. That'll lead up probably the rest of our day if we do that, and not particularly helpful. I think the key parts were excerpted here. The only other names I recognize on the list, they all give their credentials, so they're prominent folks, no doubt about it, but only a couple of names jumped out at me that I'll mention as I scroll through them here. As I recall, there were two. Erwin Chemerinsky, dean and, chair at a professor of law at Berkeley, who we see show up quite a lot as an expert in a lot of things. I'm not going to read the full title of his chair because it's a waste of time. The other name that jumped out at me was Mark Tushnet, who, you remember him from the Constitutional Hardball article that I refer to very frequently. He, of course, a Harvard Law School professor emeritus, I guess, at this point. And that's pretty interesting that he would jump in on this, too. And it tells you a little something about his continuing interest in constitutional hardball, and I guess he considers this within those bounds. But of course, his whole article, the whole premise is about changing the bounds all the time. So let's see, a couple of other things that I wanted to discuss. Let me throw in this one. This is a much discussed piece by Chauncey DeVega, who many of you already know and may follow on Twitter these days, and know from, all over the internets, writing in Salon. Will the mainstream media ever face its failure to tell the truth about January 6th? Very important. A lot of people really appreciated some of this article and shared some great quotes from it. We'll share as much as we can before we run out of time. How about that? Media voices proclaimed that Trump was a buffoon who could never stage a coup. Now they just want us to forget. That's a good point, I think, and that's just the subheader. A year or so ago, many of the most professional, smart people in the mainstream news media felt certain that Donald Trump and his allies would not attempt a coup. Those of us who warned that Trump would do anything to stay in power were described as hysterical or alarmist and suffering from Trump derangement syndrome. And by the way, even after the coup, they still did it. Well, it didn't work, so you're wrong. We were told that Republicans, for all their bad behavior, were patriots who loved America, and that Trump himself was too ignorant, too disorganized, and too incompetent to succeed in overturning an election. Well, he was for this one. Not that he ever stopped trying to overturn this one, by the way, even as he aims at overturning the next one. After January 6th, those who denied that such a thing was imaginable were made to look like adults who believed in Santa Claus. More important, Trump's coup was not defeated. Its ringleaders and organizers are not in jail, right, but are walking free and overtly planning for a more successful attempt next time. All true. Donald Trump and the other ringleaders and organizers are still not in prison. They are walking free and have not been punished. Trump and his fascist movement are continuing their nationwide effort to undermine multiracial democracy through spreading the big lie and using lawsuits, legislation, and other means, including threats of terrorism and political violence, to restrict the right to vote, particularly for black and brown people and other key members of the Democratic base. How have many of the gatekeepers of approved public discourse in America responded to the events of January 6th and the continuing attacks on American democracy? For the most part, by throwing their huge mistake down the memory hole. The boldest among them now present themselves as full-throated defenders of American democracy, claiming that they actually warned the country and the world about Trump's imminent coup attempt. Ooh, that's interesting. They simply hope that the public is not paying attention. To watch this public rewrite of American history in real time is something like seeing a TV series recast a prominent character with a new actor in the middle of the season while pretending that nothing has changed. Given the limited attention span of the American people at large, hey, by the way, did you know Tom Brady was back in... Yeah, this ploy may work. But the constant torrent of revelations about the Trump cabal's coup attempts has made it increasingly difficult for the media and political classes to maintain that charade. Last week, we learned about right-wing legal scholar John Eastman, who created a how-to guide designed to encourage Vice President Mike Pence to overturn the Electoral College votes in Congress and award Trump a bogus victory. In an essay at New York Magazine, Jonathan Chait describes Eastman's guide to overthrowing America's constitutional order. And, well, let's say he describes it very well. And the point is that I'm going to run out of time and that Chauncey has put together a very powerful argument and that you ought to spend some time reading it. It's really summarized pretty well up at the top. Yeah, they all told us it couldn't possibly happen and then that it didn't happen. And yet the effort continues, and interesting how some of them now say, oh, see, I told you this was going to happen the whole time. All right, well, time now to hand over the microphone to Justice Putnam for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. He told you all about what's going to happen, and as a matter of fact, he's telling me right now what's going to happen on his show. We'll see if his predictions are correct.
From networksradio.com, you have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
We'll start off here. Mitch McConnell is daring Democrats to reform the filibuster. I think we should take him up on that dare. The Treasury Department told Arizona's governor that his state could not use federal funds to pay for programs aimed at undermining face mask requirements in schools. That sounds like a good decision. Plus some other good decisions and some crappy ones from around the country and around the world. Next.